I've called this First Thoughts because the more I thought about this subject, and the more I discussed it with clients, colleagues, and friends, the more I realised that there is a lot more to it than had appeared to me at first. I may or may not end up calling this approach special interest therapy, or it may simply remain a useful light bulb moment. As with so many things, everything, I have my clients to thank for this. Autistic special interests have been pathologized as highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. Yes, that is a diagnostic criterion from the DSM. But these special interests are not just interests. They stem from and give access to the deepest part of the person. It is so easy when a client talks about their hobbies or the events of the day to think that they are avoiding the essentials. But what if, in fact, they are doing just the opposite? Not an escape from, but an escape into. When seen through the lens of monotropism, this starts to make a lot of sense. By the end of this video, you should have a clearer idea about the nature of monotropism and of autistic special interests, and of the link between the two, and maybe some thoughts about how this may change the way you do therapy. And as you'll discover at the end, I'm also wondering whether this might be a legitimate way of working not just with autistic people, but with others who may have this kind of deep special interest. As Samantha Stein put it, autistic traits are human traits. Surely there are some non-autistics out there who will recognise this. I'm going to talk briefly, there is so much more to say, about the place of so-called special interests in my therapeutic work with autistic clients. This isn't a theory that I have created. It is something that has grown up organically over the years. As always, my clients are my best teachers. As a person-centered therapist, I don't work with issues or problems or diagnoses. I work with human beings of all kinds, and each one is that one unique individual to whom Kierkegaard addressed all his theological and spiritual works. And if we are going to work together, then I need to be seeing the client's world, as far as I can, through the client's eyes. Carl Rogers, who incidentally was also a disciple of Kierkegaard, from whom he nicked his famous phrase, "to become the self which one truly is," said, "The best vantage point for understanding behaviour is from the internal frame of reference of the individual." Behaviour, yes, also emotions, thought processes, reactions, the lot. This involves some very active listening. I liken it to a cat stalking prey. You have to be ready at any point to spot something important moving in the undergrowth of talk and catch it before it disappears. I wrote this poem about the technique known as focusing, in which you pay deep, open and non-judging attention to the feelings that arise in your body, an internal knowledge which is experienced but not yet expressed in words. It applies equally to the deep attention you pay to what your client is saying and how. Feeling after, waiting, watching, quivering, following the thread because there is a thread of scent, a thread of sound, a thread of moving air. Eyes distract, close them and scent, close them and hear, close them and feel. It's warm. The air moves. Never too late. Pounce. One of the official diagnostic criteria for autism in the DSM-5 is the following: highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus. For example, strong attachment to or preoccupation with unusual objects, excessively circumscribed or perseverative interest. I love the way this is presented as a symptom, a deficiency, a disorder. In this slide, I offer one possible translation, you could think of many others, from medical language into human language. Autistic traits are human traits. So what is restricted? Would you describe a scientist who spends their life trying to find a cure for a particular type of cancer as having a restricted interest? How about very concentrated, clearly delineated? What is fixated? Isn't it just another word for intense and focused? What is abnormal? How about rephrasing that as out of the ordinary or even extraordinary? It means the same thing, but immediately loses its negative connotation. Is it abnormal to like dulcimer music rather than piano music, for example? Or is it simply out of the ordinary, not mainstream? That also rather changes the phrase intensity or focus. Shall we try extraordinarily intense and focused? There's nothing wrong with attachment to one's interests, but I don't think that's strong enough. It is an identification with them. They become part of who we are. I'm not keen on preoccupation, though. There is, again, this negative note. It's not good to be preoccupied. Curious now. What is excessively? Excessively according to whom? To whom is it a problem? If not to the interested person, then who is anyone else to judge? Let's try remarkable. What is perseverative? Where does perseverance, apparently a good thing, end, and perseveration, apparently a bad thing, begin? And again, who is anyone but the interested person to judge? In fact, these so-called highly restricted fixated interests are a source of autistic joy and can be as much a strength as a weakness, as much a wealth as a deficiency. They are connected with monotropism, more on that later, and also with what is delightfully called weak central coherence, which, despite its name, is not a weakness. What it means is that autistic people are more likely, on the whole, to see details rather than the whole picture. The whole does not, so to speak, cohere centrally. For example, say you, non-autistic, and I, autistic, are looking out of my study window towards my garden and the hills. You exclaim, "It's so green." I stare at you, mystified, and reply, "It's golden." I am looking at the laburnum tree just below the window. You are looking at the whole view, which is mostly vegetable plants and green hills. Here is a visual aid for poor central coherence. A very dear friend painted this for me as a thank you gift. At first I was at a loss, not just to see what, if anything, it depicted, but even, oh, embarrassment, to work out which way up I should be looking at it. Now that I know it is to be viewed this way up, and that it depicts a cat, I can not only see the cat, but also appreciate it, and the skill it took to create the painting. I have tried it out on other autistic people, and they responded exactly as I did. Just a couple of days ago, I had a perfect example of weak central coherence in practice. I was in a cafe with a friend, and I picked up a cruet or shaker containing white crystals and with holes in the shape of an S. "Salt or sugar?" I asked my friend. She stared at me. "Salt, obviously," she replied. "Why obviously?" I asked. She sighed. She knows me. "Because," she said very patiently, "there is an equivalent cruet with holes in the shape of a pea containing grey powder, and there is a box of sugar stick packs just next to them." Well, I honestly had not noticed any of that. All I saw was the single cruet with the white crystals, so I took some pictures for use in this very presentation. Weak central coherence, focus on detail, is an important part of these special interests. Stereotypically, and often in fact, an autistic person will want to know absolutely everything about their interest and is likely to retain all that knowledge. But there are other kinds of intense focus which don't require total knowledge. The essence of an autistic special interest is not so much completeness as the deep importance it has for the person. So the focus may be on what is important to us. We may shrug off mere encyclopedic knowledge as uninteresting, insignificant. I'd say a good example of this is our tendency to listen to a piece of music on a loop, or even to snatches from that piece of music, or to sing a single phrase over and over again. I may, for example, sing over and over the refrain from a song from Ulster celebrating Beltane. Haido an you, haido a marach, haido wari wallace haidi. Haido an you, haido a marach, haido wari wallace haidi. That intense interest does something to my brain. It soothes it or stimulates it, or both. I have never got round to learning the whole song, much less can I tell you about the local Beltane ceremonies. That isn't the point. And that moves us on to monotropism. Monotropism has been described as a unified theory of autism. Fergus Murray, the offspring of the theory's originator, says this: monotropism is the tendency for our interests to pull us in more strongly than most people. It rests on a model of the mind as an interest system. We are all interested in many things, and our interests help direct our attention. Different interests are salient at different times. In a monotropic mind, fewer interests tend to be aroused at any time, and they attract more of our processing resources, making it harder to deal with things outside of our current attention tunnel. Attention tunnel is an important phrase. So that's a brief summary. I make no excuse for quoting the following paragraphs in full. This is from the original 2005 paper by Murray, Dinah Murray, Fergus's mother, Lesser and Lawson, suggesting monotropism is a basis for understanding autism. Yes, 2005. And we are still, 20 years later, talking all the nonsense about lack of empathy and theory of mind, extreme male brains, and deficiencies in communication. And behaviours. At any one moment, the amount of attention available to a conscious individual is limited. The limited availability of attention plays a fundamental role in everyday life. The assumption that attention is quantitatively limited is supported by the finite supply of metabolites available to the brain. It is implicit throughout experimental psychology in the concept of task demand. The authors suggest that competition between mental processes for scarce attention is an important factor in the shaping of the cognitive process. It is generally accepted that focus is a quality of attention. However, this optical metaphor may be extended to parameterize focus of attention between diffused light at one extreme and a torch beam at the other. That is to say, attention may be broadly distributed over many interests or may be concentrated in a few interests. The authors propose that the strategies employed for the allocation of attention are normally distributed and to a large degree genetically determined. And here are the killer paragraphs. We propose that diagnosis of autism selects those few individuals at the deep or tight focus extreme of this distribution of strategies. Furthermore, the authors propose that social interactions, the use of language, and the shifting of the object of attention are all tasks that require broadly distributed attention. Consequently, these activities are inhibited by the canalization of available attention into a few highly aroused interests. In other words, social interactions, the use of language, and the shifting of the object of attention are more difficult for monotropic minds. Our hypothesis is that the difference between autistic and non-autistic is a difference in the strategies employed in the distribution of scarce attention. That is to say, it is the difference between having few interests highly aroused, the monotropic tendency, and having many interests less highly aroused, the polytropic tendency. An aroused interest is an interest charged with feeling. As Lesser and colleagues point out, individuals on the autism spectrum tend to be either passionately interested or not interested at all. Obviously, this is a generalization, but it's not a bad one. This is one of the reasons why we have what is known as the spiky profile. Generally speaking, if you know how a polytropic person performs in one area, you have a reasonable chance of knowing how they will perform in another apparently related area. Not so with the monotropic person. At least minimal interest is required in order to acquire skills, whether that is in playing the harp or in navigating social situations. And if, as I've just said, social interactions and the shifting of attention, you need loads of that in social situations, require a broad beam approach, they will take up a great deal of the available mental processes and will be, I quote, inhibited by the canalization of available attention into a few highly aroused interests. As indeed will attention to anything else that does not catch the monotropic person's interest. An autistic person's special interest is not like anything else. It is not, despite the phrase, just an interest. Not just an interest that outweighs all others. It is also not an obsession. It is something else. It is the ground of our being. It is our taste, our flavour, our musical key, G major if you're wondering, our landscape, where we live, the sense of ourselves, and it is our language. It is what we return to time and again when we really want to express something. Once you have found an autistic person's special interest, you have found that person. Anyone who knows me knows that if I talk about Gaelic or Irish music, I'm not talking about something random or changing the subject because I'm bored or don't like the current subject. I am taking a big risk by talking to you about what really matters to me, what is closest to my heart. I am risking your telling me that the thing that makes me me is of no interest to you, or by implication of no interest to anyone. So I will briefly tell you about my interest, which may give you some idea of how this works for us. For me, it is about music and sounds and the taste of the music and sounds together. You could call it vocal stimming with a touch of echolalia. Remember that wee Irish refrain I sang earlier? I did a workshop recently on this subject at Autscape, an annual residential autistic gathering or conference. Here's the opening slide. It included examples of songs, with refrains for the audience to join in with. I am not a professional singer or even performer, as they no doubt discovered. I am an autistic person who really wants other people to get it, to find a way into the joy that this special interest brings to me. And I'm willing to stand up in front of 200 people and sing to them in 10 different languages, or was it 9, in order to get that across. Because the thing is the point, not the performance. That was the first time I had ever talked about this slightly offbeat special interest. I had always felt that what I wanted to share was much too weird. Well, clearly it wasn't. Music is my special interest and my language, though perhaps in an unusual way. Throughout my life, the combination of a particular language and the way its traditional music fits that language has caught my imagination and spoken to me. The only thing that has changed through my life is which language. I don't often sing in English. Maybe English is too familiar for me to be able to taste the words in conjunction with the music. Maybe I dislike my own RP accent too much. Whatever the reason is, the fact remains. It is the taste of the combined music and words that does it for me. The taste that expresses something deep about the country, the people, something that can't be expressed in any other way. These aren't necessarily countries I grew up in, have family in, or even have any particular connection with. But there is something about that taste that lets me in, and lets me in deeply. Like tasting spaghetti alla napoletana in Naples or paella in Valencia. You know what I mean? I have no interest in knowing everything about one particular language or song type, which might look quite surprising against the stereotype in an autistic special interest. But that would be to misunderstand what my special interest is. To continue the culinary analogy, my special interest is not, say, Neapolitan food. It is the way different cultures, different countries use, cook and eat food. It's about difference and similarity and shape and colour and taste. I am on the edges of folk, of traditional Scottish Gaelic song, of Irish sean-nós. The people in the in-groups dismiss me, rightly I guess, because I don't belong in their tradition, because I don't have their breadth or depth of knowledge. But that's not what I'm about. Murray and colleagues, discussing Leo Kanner's reports on the autistic children he worked with, comment that these children tend to be highly task-focused, though their tasks may differ from ours. That's the key, and the key not just to special interests, but to everything. Autism is not a deficiency. It is an alternative, it is a difference, it is an operating system and a way of being. That phrase, their tasks may differ from ours, sums everything up. As autistic people, we are in a minority. In the well-worn comparison, we are Apple Mac, while the majority are Windows. Our tasks are different from yours. Our priorities are different from yours. Our way of communication is different from yours. Remember that article that I quoted said, social interactions, the use of language, and the shifting of the object of attention are all tasks that require broadly distributed attention. Consequently, these activities are inhibited by the canalization of available attention into a few highly aroused interests. What that means is that the non-autistic, the majority form of social interactions, use of language and capacity to shift the object of attention, and that includes multitasking, is not going to be the same as the autistic form of social interactions, use of language, and capacity to shift the object of attention. We communicate differently, and our executive function is different. Not necessarily worse, just less suited to our society as currently constituted. We see the details, you see the whole. We are monotropic, with few interests highly aroused. You are polytropic, with many interests less highly aroused. We do not choose our special interests. They choose us. They come from the ground of our being. If you're working in an electronics repair shop, you really do need to know whether the device you've been given to repair works on Windows or Mac OS. Just as both have their own ways of functioning well, they also both have their own ways in which things can go wrong. A Windows specialist is likely to be stymied if you bring in your malfunctioning MacBook Air. No, really, believe me, they are. They may assume that the problem is X, when actually it is Y. And in trying to solve the problem, they don't only misunderstand it, they may well actually make it worse. And that is why it is so important for a therapist who works with autistic clients to understand what autism actually is, and ideally have an understanding of how that operating system works. And the way into the operating system, as operated by that individual, is the special interest. I am sure you have experienced the client who avoids the important subjects by starting to talk about what they've done that day or what their dog did on their morning walk. And it's easy to think, back on the dog walk. But When an autistic person does that, it is worth stopping and noticing. And if it recurs, ask yourself whether this is an escape from or into their real world. I'll say that again because it is the key. It is crucial. It is the crux. When an autistic person starts to talk about their special interest, then stop. Stop and listen, and follow where they take you. They are not avoiding their real world or the real issue. They are offering you a door into it. Following them may take some courage because you don't know where they will lead. The country will not be familiar, and you have to trust them to find the way. I have permission from all the following clients to talk about their special interests and how we have used them in therapy. It would perhaps be more appropriate to say how they have taught me to use them in therapy, since, as I say, my clients are and have been from the very start my best teachers. All the clients talked about have given specific permission for what I say. Their names have been changed and there are no identifying details except the special interests themselves. I have to thank Nina above all for my growing realization that this way of working is, on the whole, specific to autistic people, to autistic clients, and maybe to autistic therapists. Because then both sides are monotropic. Both sides have fewer interests more highly aroused. And because then both sides have that particular language, which when we risk using it, gives access to the deepest part of ourselves. Nina was never afraid to talk about her special interest, her life passion, the thing that gives access to the deepest part of herself. It's kayaking. And maybe at first I made that mistake that I mentioned earlier, thinking that she was avoiding talking about the hard stuff by chatting about her hobby. I should have spotted earlier on that everything truly important about Nina could be expressed in terms of her approach to kayaking, teaching and leading, running the local club. Her empathy, her kindness, and her confidence and tolerance for her own mistakes as well as those of others. Her capacity for flow states and her deep knowledge of when she was and when she was not being herself. I should have spotted it. But a moment came when Nina talked not so much about the activities of the club or of her paddles with her friends, as about the experience of being on the water, the transition from land to water, the heightened awareness, the oneness with everything, the peace, the safety, the deepest of being the self one truly is. That is what life can be like, and that is the life that Nina aspires to. Trauma and struggles, late diagnosed autism and ADHD notwithstanding. And that is when it dawned on me that Nina was speaking her own language, that she was telling me about herself, and that when she was talking about kayaking, she was always doing exactly that. There were traumas in her past, there were difficulties in her present, but maybe paradoxically, when she was talking about those directly, she was less present to herself, less present to her experience, than when she was talking about the feel of the water on her skin, the sun on the water, the rain lashing down, the moment when she hit an obstacle and the boat flipped. We tracked her growing tolerance, acceptance, appreciation, admiration, even love for herself, not so much by sitting and getting in touch with her feelings, but by observing her feelings as she interacted with the boat, the water, her peers, the instructors, the people she was instructing and leading, the people who appreciated her, the people who didn't, all in the context of the kayak clubs. I have so often heard a client say, "I don't know who I am," or "I don't know what I want." I have two basic approaches: go very small or go very large. The very small involves finding something, anything, to which the client's answer is instantaneous. For example, do you take sugar in your coffee? Or is there a political party you would absolutely never vote for? I haven't yet found anyone who can't answer those two questions without a second's hesitation. The very large involves a question something like, if you had a magic wand and you could wish for absolutely anything, within or out with the bounds of possibility, what would you wish for? Or, if you were guaranteed success, what would you do? This one often involves a few false starts, wishes that are too limited, too small, too easy to achieve. But when the real answer comes, it comes with conviction. And with autistic clients, the special interest is large, but can often be disguised as small. We have been trained by society to minimize our monotropic interest, our few interests highly aroused. We have been trained either to treat them as unimportant hobbies or else not to mention them at all. George is another who knows very well who he is, knows very well what matters and how his truest self manifests itself. But for nearly half a century of life he lived as Georgina, and was, as he puts it, not with himself. Georgina conformed to the expectations of society, behaving as if her interest in horses was just a charming girly hobby, and as if her work as a sculptor was very skilled, but being basically figurative, not of any particular interest to the current art world. And she found herself so much of the time with people who dabbled in horses and art, and thought that they had anything at all in common with her. For George, it was intolerable. Not only being among people with whom he had nothing in common, but being with people who thought they did, people who did not see him at all. Not his deep affinity with horses, not his nature as a serious and significant sculptor, not even his gender. George, like Nina, at first talked casually about horses and sculpture, which incidentally often come together in what he makes. But I had learned from Nina, and I did not make the same mistake again. I knew that when George talked about these things, he was talking about his deepest self. When I first met Nina, she was struggling to bend herself out of shape sufficiently to get through a university degree. Nina is exceptionally intelligent and had done well in her school exams, despite being unable to attend school for the last couple of years. So she had expected to do well at university. If it had simply been a matter of intelligence, she would have sailed through with a first, and indeed that is what everyone expected. But her cognitive style, her autism, her ADHD instantly tripped her up. Everything was confusing, nothing was accessible, it was all overwhelming, and in the absence of a monotropic interest in the subject, her motivation disappeared. As Wen Lawson suggests, for a monotropic mind, it is almost impossible to force motivation for something in which there is no deep interest. Nina will get her degree, probably not a first, but her experiences have only made it clearer what she is and what she isn't made for. Both George and Nina recognise the urgency of living in such a way as to have their special interest outwardly as well as inwardly the centre and ground of their being. I am not a religious person. I might even say, and I know this is deeply unfashionable, that I'm not a particularly spiritual person. My experiences of religion, or even spirituality, have not generally been good. The language of religion and spirituality does not come naturally to me. And yet, when an autistic client leads me into their spiritual or even religious world, I enter it with interest and curiosity, confident that they will lead me not into an abstract belief system, but deeper into the essential work of therapy. It might be Claire, with her deep lived and academic understanding of Buddhism. At first, the routes we were travelling were unfamiliar to me, but slowly Claire's inner landscape became clearer. And it now seems to me that she and I have almost reached the stage where we are bilingual. Or maybe we have found a pair of languages that are mutually understandable, much as Irish Gaelic and Scottish Gaelic are. She speaks Vedana, I speak focusing, and mostly we understand each other, with the occasional pause to clarify a translation. Or Danny, who came out of an abusive church and is learning to trust her own path, with Druidry at the centre, researching deeply and sitting lightly to it. One of the crucial things that this rerouting symbolises in Danny's life is finding her own voice, finding her no, without which any yes has no meaning. Or Bria, with her very individual but deeply researched use of astrology and the tarot to make sense of her and her family's experience. Bria says, "Everything I learn is through the lens of astrology." An example that stays with me is the way she understands her capacity for letting go of a thing, once she is at peace with it, through the fact that Mars is in Pisces in her chart, and that has to do with cutting things off. Mars is a knife, and Pisces is a cycle breaker. Also her comment that traditional astrology and hers are different dialects of the same language. A language which I do not naturally speak, but in which I take tentative steps at toddler level to connect with Bria, whose native language it is. None of these people is trying to convert or convince me. I need not agree with any element of what they are saying. The point is to show me where they live, the language they speak, the patterns, the shapes, the landscapes, what follows from what they see. My landscape, where I come from, is not the point. And perhaps that explains why there is never any temptation to compare my interests with theirs, or even for them to persuade me that I should share their interest. It is enough that I am accompanying them with complete attention. However, my language, as I've said, is music. And when I come upon a client whose language is also music, I have to be very careful. It is their world, their frame of reference that I want to see. I do not want to drag them into mine, or to try to create a sort of hybrid, an Esperanto that represents neither of us. It helped a lot that Eloise's type of music was one that I knew nothing about, that I would probably not greatly enjoy listening to. Eloise is a DJ, though she prefers anti-DJ. She creates mixes and she speaks a music language I don't fully understand, though Eloise expresses herself extremely clearly, and I've done enough research for it to make some sense to me. And that research, to my mind, very definitely counts as CPD, continuing professional development, although I can imagine the audit team at the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society being mildly confused, if not shocked, to see a DJ crash course for beginners from the London Academy of Music Production among my CPD for the year. But to my mind, it is no less important, if I want to enter into Eloise's frame of reference, than a course in coercive control might be if I were working with a domestic abuse survivor. I need to understand that in some ways playing in clubs, which Eloise loves doing and at which she excels, is the last thing that her autistic self should be doing. All those people with whom she is expected to interact before and after her set, all those lights, all that noise in particular when she is playing, because like so many autists, she finds it hard to separate out different strands of sound. She cannot hear what she is playing and needs to trust to her knowledge of the tracks and her equipment and all the practice that she has done beforehand. People say, "Oh, you'll get used to it, and eventually you'll be able to hear what you're playing." Well, maybe to some extent, but never to the extent that they think, and never without exhausting effort. So this becomes a symbol, a vehicle, for Eloise's thoughts about balancing effort and return in the rest of her life. Just as with Nina and kayaking, when Eloise talks about her struggles with playing live in a club, she is talking about far more than that. She is talking about her whole life, and not in a considered narrative way, but viscerally, from the depths, expressing the struggle that it is to be an autist in a non-autistic society. Yes, she could confine herself to her regular radio program and similar events, but it would be confining, a loss of something that is almost too overwhelming to do, but is also a source of unparalleled autistic joy. It seems to me that the monotropic nature of our brains and the fact that we have fewer interests more highly aroused also goes a long way to explaining two things. First, our lack of interest in small talk, and second, the stereotype that we lack empathy. The first is true, the second emphatically is not. As Wen Lawson said, those of us who have this type of brain don't have much motivation to engage in the things that do not engage our brain. And unless we are particularly engaged by meteorology, which of course some of us are, we genuinely cannot understand why people should spend time discussing the weather, about which they do not much care. It's hard for me and for other autists I've discussed this with, to get our heads round the apparent fact that some people actually prefer to talk about things that do not particularly engage them. They do not want to have a deep conversation about linguistics or surrealist film, or indeed meteorology, when they are down the pub of an evening. But we do. And if I am right about special interests giving access to a person's deepest self, and having a central place in therapy, then this deep conversation, apparently about the use of meaningless vocables in traditional songs of different countries, is actually performing many of the tasks of therapy, and may well leave the participants more regulated, less anxious, and more in tune with themselves. Maybe, I honestly couldn't tell you, the surface level chit-chat about the weather and what they are making for tea serves the same purpose. But it would be a great pity if either monotropics or polytropics felt that the other way was the only right way, and they should change themselves, or indeed, if either monotropics or polytropics felt that their own way was the only right way, and they should change, or oppose, or dismiss the other. In a letter written after the death of Dinah Murray, Wen Lawson writes, Dinah concluded that in the allistic, that's non-autistic world, interests were many-faceted. Individuals used their language to capture the attention of others and draw them into their own interests. That is, language was used to manipulate the interests of others. She then proposed that in autism, our brains were operating via attention tunnels and a lack of guile, which meant that we were taken over by our own interest, with no spare attention to join that of others. This is of immense importance because it seems to me to explain very elegantly what the stereotype has interpreted as autistic people lacking empathy. We do not lack empathy, but we use language and social interaction in, so to speak, a guileless way. If we lack anything, we lack guile, and guile is something that most of us never quite learn. Even our masking or camouflaging is transparent, or at best confusing. We find it very hard to lie, and most of us have an overwhelming and even painful sense of justice. One of the side effects, so to speak, is that most naturally we speak from what is within ourselves, our inner landscape, rather than what might be in the other. But capturing the attention of others and drawing them into our own interests is something that many of us struggle hugely to do, let alone manipulating the interests of others. The way we experience empathy is by a genuine meeting of interests. Whether it is yours or mine does not essentially matter, though out with a therapy setting, it does need to be mutual. You will never get to know an autist, and we will never work out what it is that makes you tick, unless the meeting is on that level. So the next time you're in the therapy room with an autistic client, and they start to talk about the architecture of London, the rolling hills of the Borders, the geology of the Highlands, the desert of Arizona, the ocean, whatever and wherever, stop and listen. Yes, it just might be avoidance, but more likely it is a first tentative invitation to you to join them in their landscape, their world. Don't worry if you know nothing about it. Perhaps it's better if you don't. Just let them lead, and you will discover. You won't even need a map. Now, I did say at the beginning that this was a First Thoughts presentation. Maybe it's part of my own monotropism, but I find that whenever I'm doing research, whether for an article, a book chapter, or a presentation, the rabbit holes I go down turn out to be enormous warrens with the most unexpected byways, and I emerge from them in quite a different place from where I started. I start a chapter on working as a therapist in small communities, and I find myself digging deep into the feminist theory of therapy. I start an article on autistic people in the workplace, and I find myself questioning the medical model, not just of autism, obviously, but of almost all so-called mental illness. I start a workshop on spiritual abuse, and I end up investigating why autistic people seem so vulnerable to coercive control. And this one is no exception. And so I would really like to invite responses from anyone who has found themselves working in this way, whether they are autistic or not, and whether their client is autistic or not. So I've put my email address on this slide. Because, as I said at the beginning, autistic traits are human traits. It is not true that we are all a little bit autistic, but it is definitely true that all autistic people are 100% human. Whether or not animals can be autistic is something I will leave to the experts. I gather that there have been some studies with dogs that suggest that some may be, and the book All Cats Are Autistic is not entirely tongue-in-cheek. And so, although I'm not keen on the word Aspie, and the Aspie quiz has at least as many faults as any other assessment tool, I do like the way the results are depicted, as points in a circle. Look at this. Note, neurodiverse on the right-hand side should be neurodivergent, in other words, not neurotypical. Although the 81 autistic people who completed the quiz are very different, all the results tend towards the right-hand side. If it had been 81 very different neurotypical people, you would see an approximate mirror image. So yes, autists and non-autists have a lot in common. It is the pattern that shows which you are, not any trait in isolation. Because the best expression of a special interest that I have ever heard was actually not written by an autistic person at all, but by a poet friend of mine who has been a knitter and crocheter all her life. It is not a hobby. It is how she expresses herself. In the years when she didn't write poetry with words on paper, she wrote poetry in yarns with colours and textures and shapes instead. By a peculiarly horrible twist of fate, she has developed a neurological condition affecting her hands, which means that she can no longer either knit or crochet. If you don't understand special interests, you will not understand what that means to her. It is like becoming invisible and inaudible, almost like ceasing to be oneself. This was written after one of the many visits to a doctor who didn't get it. She has said, I can give her name, which is Jane Pern, and here's a plug for her latest book of poetry called Picking Up Signals. Things that hurt. I tell the doctor that it hurts to knit, that it hurts that I can't knit now. He smiles at me in a vague and condescending way. I, who could create wonder from thin sticks and a ball of yarn, who wrapped love around needles and turned it into warmth, who made trees appear upon a background of grass with just the use of my fingers, who devised patterns, crafted jokes, who helped to decorate a town at night just because, and watched the amazement the next morning. I who created cloud-soft shawls for newborns, could magic something wearable from a grandchild's art, who conjured with fleece of sheep and wool of lamb, with flax, alpaca, merino, mohair, silk, and understood the properties of each, whose hands knew the ropes of cable and twist, moss and rib, the rhythmic movements, the rap, the slip, the way that stitch by stitch and row by row the fabric grows. It is loss. It is bereavement. He smiles at me in a vague and condescending way.